I still remember the night everything collapsed. The silence in my room felt louder than my own heartbeat. I had just walked away from a relationship I thought would last forever, and suddenly the world seemed darker, heavier, colder. I kept asking myself how love could vanish so quickly, how promises could break so easily. I felt empty, like a stranger in my own skin. And then, in that silence, I heard a gentle knock on my door. It was my roommate, someone I had lived with for months but never really looked at closely. That night, his voice, his presence, and his quiet way of caring opened a door I never knew existed. A door that would change everything. The first days after the breakup felt like walking through a storm without shelter. Everything inside me was raw. My chest carried an ache that didn't go away, no matter how many times I tried to distract myself with music or scrolling endlessly on my phone. The apartment felt larger than it actually was, almost like the walls had moved further apart just to remind me how alone I was now. Everywhere I turned there were reminders of her, a mug she left behind, the faint trace of her perfume on my hoodie, even the way I caught myself looking at my phone, expecting a text that would never come. Nights were the worst. When the city quieted down and the light from the street outside softened through the blinds, I felt swallowed by silence. Sleep never came easily. Instead, I lay awake replaying conversations, arguments, moments when I thought we were unshakable. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how fragile it all had been, how maybe I had been blind to the cracks that were always there. I didn't cry in loud bursts, it wasn't like that. My sadness was quieter, heavier, something that pressed down on me like invisible weight. It lived in the way I couldn't bring myself to cook, the way I ignored the pile of laundry, the way I avoided mirrors because I didn't recognize the tired eyes staring back. Through all this, my roommate moved around the apartment with a kind of awareness that didn't need words. He never intruded, never forced me to talk, but I noticed how he started doing small things I hadn't paid attention to before. He washed the dishes I left in the sink, folded the blanket I had tossed on the couch, left a cup of tea near my desk without saying a word. At first, I thought it was just politeness, the kind of thing anyone would do. But the more I noticed, the more it hit me that he was watching quietly, caring in his own way. One night I was sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, trying to understand how my life had unraveled so quickly. I hadn't even turned on the lights, the only glow came from the street outside. Then came a soft knock on my door. It wasn't loud, just enough to pull me back from my spiral. He peeked in, his voice almost hesitant, asking if I was okay. I wanted to say yes, to shrug it off like I always did, but for some reason the word got stuck in my throat. Instead, I gave a small shake of my head. He didn't press for details. He just came in, sat at the corner of the bed, and stayed there without saying much. The silence that usually felt unbearable suddenly felt different. Lighter, maybe even safe. We didn't need to fill it with words. After a while, he said, "It's okay not to be okay right now," and those simple words hit me harder than any long speech ever could. For the first time in days, I felt like someone saw through the mess inside me without judgment. The hours that followed were quiet. We talked about random things, not the breakup, not my pain, but little stories from our days, funny memories, even meaningless topics like favorite movies. Yet, in that moment, those small things felt like lifelines. They pulled me out of my head and reminded me that life still existed outside of my heartbreak. I found myself laughing, even if only for a second, and that laugh felt strange, almost foreign, like I had forgotten what it was to feel something lighter than sadness. When he finally stood to leave, he didn't give me advice or try to fix me. He just said, "I'm here if you need me," and walked out. I sat there in the dim light long after he left, staring at the closed door. His words echoed in my mind. I realized how rare it was for someone to offer presence instead of solutions, patience instead of pressure. It was such a small gesture, but it felt massive to me. In the days that followed, I began to notice how much his presence softened the sharp edges of my loneliness. He didn't hover, but he had a way of appearing exactly when I needed it most, like when I sat staring blankly at my untouched dinner, and he slid his plate over, joking that food tastes better when shared, or when he casually asked if I wanted to watch a show together, giving me an excuse to step out of my thoughts for a while. At night, when the heaviness returned, I found myself listening for the sound of him moving around in the other room. It was a strange comfort, knowing he was there, close enough to remind me I wasn't completely alone. I didn't think much about it then, but deep down, something was shifting. A part of me I thought was broken beyond repair started to stir, almost like a light flickering faintly in the dark. I couldn't name it, and I didn't want to. All I knew was that, for the first time since my breakup, I felt a tiny spark of relief. And it came not from my own strength, but from the quiet kindness of the person I had always seen as just my roommate. The days after that night began to carry a different rhythm. The heaviness of my breakup was still there, like a shadow following me everywhere I went, but it no longer drowned me completely. It was as if having someone quietly nearby kept the grief from swallowing me whole. I started spending more time sitting in the living room instead of locking myself in my room. Sometimes I didn't even talk, I would just sit with my laptop open, pretending to work while my roommate scrolled through his phone or flipped through channels on the TV. There was something about the silence between us that felt healing, not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that didn't demand explanations. Slowly, without realizing it, I started talking. At first, it was simple things, complaints about work, how tired I felt, how strange it was to be alone after being so used to someone always texting or calling me. He never interrupted or rushed me. He listened with this calm patience, nodding every now and then, letting me unload all the noise in my head. One night, when the apartment was dim and the city outside felt quieter than usual, I told him about the moment my ex and I decided to end things. I had never spoken the details out loud before, and the words felt sharp on my tongue. I explained how she had grown distant, how every conversation turned into a disagreement, how I held on even when I knew she was already slipping away. I admitted how much it hurt when she finally said she wasn't happy anymore. Saying it out loud made my chest ache all over again, but instead of falling apart, I found myself breathing easier, like I had released something that was suffocating me. He didn't judge me, didn't try to tell me what I should have done differently. He just said, "That must have been really hard," in a voice so steady and sincere that I felt tears sting my eyes. For the first time, I wasn't defending myself or trying to prove I had done my best, I was just being heard. After that night, our conversations became a habit. Sometimes they stretched late into the night, starting with casual topics and slowly drifting into the deeper ones. He told me stories from his past, too, about the times he felt like an outsider in his own family, about the struggles he faced just trying to be himself in a world that often misunderstood him. Listening to him opened my eyes in ways I hadn't expected. I realized that while I was drowning in heartbreak, he had been carrying his own silent battles all along. The honesty in his words made me respect him in a new way. I saw how strong he really was, not in a loud, obvious sense, but in the way he had learned to live with truth, even when it wasn't easy. Our nights became a ritual. We'd sit in the kitchen with cups of tea or leftovers on the table, talking until the clock pushed toward midnight. He had this way of slipping humor into the conversation just when I felt myself getting too heavy, and it always made me smile despite the ache in my chest. I started to notice things about him that I hadn't before. The way his eyes lit up when he talked about something he loved, the way his laugh filled the room like a spark, the way he leaned back in his chair with a kind of ease that made me want to relax, too. I didn't think much about it then, it just felt comforting, like I was finally breathing after holding my breath for too long. Still, there were moments when confusion stirred inside me. One evening, after he listened to me pour out another memory of my ex, I caught myself watching him a little too long, noticing the softness in his expression, the way he seemed to carry my pain as if it were his own. It was a fleeting thought, something I quickly pushed away, telling myself I was only grateful for his friendship. But deep down, I couldn't ignore how much lighter I felt around him, how much easier it was to face the day knowing he was there at the end of it. As the weeks passed, I realized I wasn't grieving the same way anymore. The wound was still tender, but it didn't bleed like it used to. A part of me wondered if it was because of time, or if it was because of him. Maybe both. He became the anchor I didn't know I needed, keeping me steady when everything else felt unsteady. I started to look forward to coming home, to hearing his voice, to sharing those quiet hours that had become the highlight of my days. The loneliness that once seemed unbearable was no longer as sharp, and though I couldn't admit it yet, something inside me was slowly beginning to shift in a way I had never expected. It happened so gradually that I almost didn't notice at first. The long talks with my roommate had become the rhythm of my nights, something I looked forward to after the weight of each day. But one evening, as he was laughing at something I said, I found myself staring at him longer than I meant to. His laugh was full, unrestrained, and for the first time I noticed the way his eyes narrowed slightly when he smiled, how genuine it looked, how alive he seemed in that moment. It caught me off guard. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just grateful for his presence, that my mind was only clinging to the person who had been there for me when I was most vulnerable. Still, the thought lingered in the back of my mind long after the laughter had faded. I started noticing details I had never paid attention to before. The way his hair fell carelessly across his forehead when he leaned over the couch to grab the remote, the sound of his voice when it dropped lower late at night, carrying a calmness that seemed to quiet everything inside me. Even the way he moved through our apartment seemed different to me now, unhurried, natural, but with a kind of confidence that I had overlooked before. It made me wonder if I had been blind to these things all along, or if heartbreak had sharpened my vision to the small, delicate details of life I never appreciated. One night, as we sat on the balcony, he opened up about something he had never shared before. The air was cool, carrying the faint hum of the city, and for a long time we had been sitting in comfortable silence. Then, out of nowhere, he told me about the first time he realized he was different, the first time he realized he was attracted to men. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet vulnerability under his words, like each one carried years of weight. He told me about how hard it was to admit it to himself, how he tried to ignore it for years, convincing himself it was just a phase. He shared how people around him made careless jokes, how he felt like he had to shrink himself, hide parts of who he was just to fit in. I listened, and for the first time, I saw him in a completely different light. He wasn't just my roommate who had been kind enough to listen to me cry about my breakup, he was someone who had carried battles silently, who had endured loneliness and misunderstanding far deeper than anything I had experienced. I couldn't find words at first. My chest felt tight, not with pity, but with a strange mix of admiration and sadness for all the times he must have felt invisible. When I finally spoke, I told him I admired his courage. He gave a small smile, almost shy, and shrugged like it wasn't a big deal. But it was. To me, it was huge. Something in me shifted that night. As I lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying the sound of his voice, the way his eyes looked as he told me the truth about himself. It wasn't just his story that stayed with me, it was the way he trusted me enough to share it. I realized then how safe I felt with him, how much his honesty had moved me. And somewhere deep inside, a question began to form, one I didn't want to ask myself. Why did his story matter to me so much? Why did his smile linger in my mind longer than it should have? The days that followed only made those questions louder. I caught myself waiting for him to come home, listening for his keys at the door, feeling a strange kind of excitement I hadn't felt in weeks. When he spoke, I paid attention to every word, memorizing them without meaning to. When he laughed, something inside me lifted, and when he looked at me, really looked at me, I felt warmth spreading in my chest that I couldn't explain away anymore. I tried to dismiss it as gratitude, as the bond of friendship formed in the aftermath of pain. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something inside me was stirring, something I had never allowed myself to consider before. And though I didn't have the courage to name it yet, the truth was slowly becoming undeniable. I was beginning to feel something for him, something that both terrified me and pulled me closer at the same time. The bond between us deepened without either of us speaking about it directly. It started in the smallest ways, like when he would cook more than he needed for himself and casually slide a plate in front of me without asking if I was hungry, or when he noticed I left the lights on and turned them off with a teasing remark about my carelessness. I found myself waiting for these little gestures, and they became the comfort of my days. The apartment no longer felt like an empty reminder of what I had lost. Instead, it began to feel like a place where I was being rebuilt, piece by piece, not through grand actions but through his quiet presence. One evening after a particularly hard day, I came home feeling drained, the kind of exhaustion that makes your body heavy and your mind restless. I dropped onto the couch and pressed my hands against my face. Without a word, he sat down beside me and handed me a cup of tea. His silence said more than words could have, and when I finally lowered my hands, I caught the softness in his eyes. It was the kind of look that told me he understood more than I was saying, and I felt an unspoken connection in that moment that was impossible to ignore. Our time together became natural, like a rhythm we both moved to without needing to plan it. We cooked together, argued lightly about recipes, shared bowls of food while watching shows, sometimes pausing to debate the storylines as if it were the most important thing in the world. Other times, we would just sit in the same room doing different things, and yet the silence between us was never empty. It carried warmth, a sense of belonging I had not felt in a long time. I realized how much I relied on him without admitting it out loud. When my thoughts grew too heavy, I would drift into his room and collapse on his chair while he worked at his desk, just to be near him. Sometimes I didn't even talk, I just existed in his space, and it was enough to make me feel lighter. He never pushed me away, never questioned why I was there. It was as if he understood I needed that closeness more than I could explain. One night, after we had been sitting together watching a movie, I felt the weight of everything inside me break open. I hadn't planned on it, but tears spilled from my eyes without warning. He immediately muted the screen, turning his attention fully to me. I tried to brush it off, but the harder I fought, the more the tears came. He didn't ask questions. He just shifted closer and placed his hand gently on my shoulder. It wasn't the kind of touch that demanded anything, it was steady, grounding, safe. The warmth of his palm lingered through the fabric of my shirt, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself cry without shame. I leaned slightly toward him, not even realizing I had done it until I felt his body close to mine, steadying me. That closeness did something to me. It wasn't just comfort, it was something deeper, something I couldn't yet put into words. The way his hand stayed there, not rushing me, not letting go too quickly, made my chest ache in a way that wasn't painful but frighteningly tender. When the tears finally slowed, I glanced at him, and in the dim glow of the TV, I saw him differently. The same roommate I had known for months suddenly felt like someone entirely new, someone whose presence was more than just convenient or kind. It was necessary. That night, when I finally went to bed, I couldn't stop replaying the feeling of his hand on my shoulder, the weight of it, the safety it carried. It was such a small gesture, yet it left me wide awake, staring at the ceiling long into the night. My heart beat differently when I thought of him now, a rhythm that made me both nervous and comforted. I told myself it was just gratitude, that I was attaching my healing to him because of everything I had been through. But deep down, the truth was harder to deny with each passing day. It wasn't just gratitude. It wasn't just comfort. It was something deeper, something I had never allowed myself to feel before, something that scared me because of how real it felt. And though I tried to bury the thought, every time I looked at him, every time I heard his voice or saw his smile, that hidden truth rose closer to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. The confusion inside me grew heavier with each passing day. I could no longer ignore the way my heart responded when he was near, the way my chest tightened with an unfamiliar warmth whenever he laughed, or the way silence between us felt less like emptiness and more like a thread tying us together. But every time I tried to face those feelings, fear pressed down on me. My entire life, I had seen myself one way, imagined my future one way, and what I was feeling now did not fit into that picture. I told myself it was temporary, a side effect of heartbreak, a strange attachment that would fade once I healed. I tried to convince myself I was only grateful for his kindness, that I was clinging to him because I was vulnerable. Yet the more I denied it, the stronger it grew. One evening, after avoiding him most of the day, I found myself restless and unable to stay in my room. I wandered into the kitchen and found him leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone with a half-smile on his face. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment, our eyes met in a way that made my stomach tighten. I quickly looked away, fumbling with a glass of water as if I had come there with a purpose. He noticed my unease. His voice was gentle when he asked, "Are you okay? You've been distant lately." I wanted to lie, to say I was fine, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I shrugged, staring at the floor. The silence that followed felt heavier than usual, pressing down on me until I couldn't stand it anymore. The truth spilled out in fragments. I told him I didn't know what was wrong with me, that I felt confused and overwhelmed, that being around him made me feel safe but also left me questioning things about myself I didn't understand. My voice shook as I spoke, but once I started, I couldn't stop. For the first time, I admitted that I didn't recognize who I was anymore, that the lines I thought defined me were blurring in ways I couldn't control. He listened without interruption, his expression soft, his eyes steady on mine. When I finally stopped, breathless from the weight of what I had confessed, he set his phone aside and stepped closer. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," he said quietly. "It's okay to be confused. It's okay to feel safe with someone and not know what that means yet." His calmness cut through my panic, grounding me in a way nothing else could. I felt my chest loosen slightly, as if he had lifted a weight off me simply by allowing me to exist without judgment. He didn't try to define my feelings for me or tell me what they should mean. He just accepted them, accepted me, exactly as I was in that moment, messy, uncertain, afraid. I realized then how rare that kind of acceptance was, how much I had been starving for it without knowing. For so long, I had been trying to fit into expectations, to be the person I thought I was supposed to be. But with him, none of that mattered. He saw me, the real me, even the parts one didn't understand yet, and he didn't turn away. That night, after he went to his room, I lay in bed staring into the darkness. My mind was racing, but beneath the chaos, there was a quiet truth I couldn't ignore anymore. This wasn't just about gratitude. It wasn't just about friendship. What I felt when I was with him was deeper, heavier, and terrifyingly real. It scared me because it challenged everything I thought I knew about myself, but it also gave me a sense of freedom I had never experienced. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't running from my feelings. I was standing in them, raw and vulnerable, and the world hadn't collapsed. It felt like the beginning of something I couldn't name yet, but I knew it was changing me in ways I would never forget. It was during the quietest moments that the truth became impossible to avoid. There was one evening when the rain tapped steadily against the windows, filling the apartment with a rhythm that made everything feel slower, softer. We had spent the day moving through simple routines, laundry, grocery shopping, cooking dinner, and by the time night came, we were both sitting on the couch in a comfortable silence. He was stretched out with his legs tucked under him, absent-mindedly scrolling through his phone, while I sat with a book open on my lap, though I hadn't read a single line in the last 10 minutes. My eyes kept drifting to him, catching the way the light from the lamp painted shadows across his face, the relaxed curve of his mouth, the small hum he let out now and then when he found something amusing. It hit me all at once, not like a sudden explosion but like a wave I had been resisting for too long finally crashing over me. I wasn't just comforted by him. I wasn't just grateful. I was drawn to him, pulled toward him in a way that left me breathless. The realization made me shift uncomfortably, as if moving could shake the thought from my body, but it clung stubbornly to me. My chest ached, not with confusion anymore, but with the weight of something I couldn't deny. I knew then, with a clarity that scared me, that I was falling for him. The thought unsettled me so deeply that I almost stood up to leave the room, but before I could, he looked up and caught my gaze. It wasn't a long look, just a passing glance, but something in his eyes lingered, like he had noticed the way I had been watching him. My stomach tightened, and I quickly looked down at my book, pretending to be absorbed in it, though my heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear the rain anymore. Later that night, unable to sleep, I found myself pacing in my room. The questions in my head were louder than ever. How could this be happening? How could I, who had always pictured my life one way, feel this pull toward him so strongly it scared me? I thought about all the years I had carried an idea of who I was supposed to be, the kind of love I was supposed to want, and how none of it matched what I was feeling now. Yet when I tried to picture walking away from him, when I imagined putting distance between us, the thought hurt more than anything else. It wasn't a simple crush or a fleeting attachment. It was deeper, something that had taken root in me without permission. A few nights later, as if sensing the storm inside me, he asked me to join him on the balcony. The air was cool, the city humming quietly in the distance, and for a while we just sat side by side, wrapped in our own thoughts. Then he began talking, not about us, not about me, but about love. He spoke of how hard it had been to accept himself, how terrified he had been of being rejected by people he cared about, how he had convinced himself for years that it was safer to hide than to live openly. His words were raw, filled with a vulnerability that tugged at something deep inside me. As I listened, I felt both the weight of his struggle and the strength it must have taken to reach the place he was now. When he paused, I surprised myself by speaking without hesitation. I admitted I didn't know who I was anymore, that being around him had awakened feelings I had never considered before, and that I was scared of what those feelings meant. My voice shook, my hands trembled, but the words poured out anyway, unstoppable after being buried for so long. He didn't look away. He didn't let me shrink into shame. Instead, he placed his hand gently on mine, his touch warm, steady, grounding. "You don't need to label it right now," he said softly. "You just need to let yourself feel. You don't have to have all the answers to know something is real." Those words sank into me like rain on dry soil, filling cracks I hadn't even known were there. I felt tears burn at the corners of my eyes, not from sadness but from the strange relief of being allowed to be uncertain, to be unfinished, and still accepted. In that moment, I realized I didn't need to solve everything at once. I just needed to acknowledge what was happening inside me, that I was falling for him, that the way he made me feel was unlike anything I had ever experienced before, and that no matter how terrifying it was, it also felt truer than anything I had known. That night, when we finally went inside, I lay awake again, but this time the restlessness was different. It wasn't the ache of denial or the confusion of fear. It was the electric awareness of a new truth settling inside me, reshaping me quietly. I had no name for it yet, no map to follow, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I didn't want to run from it anymore. The days that followed felt charged in a way I couldn't fully explain. Every glance, every touch, every moment between us seemed to carry more weight than before. It wasn't just friendship anymore, though we hadn't said it out loud. The way his shoulder brushed against mine when we sat close on the couch, the way his laughter lingered in the air long after the sound faded, the way he looked at me when I spoke, it all meant something now, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. There was a quiet energy between us, a pull that drew me closer even when I tried to resist it. One evening, we were cooking dinner together, moving easily around each other in the kitchen. It had become one of our small rituals, chopping vegetables, teasing each other about cooking skills, sharing bites of food before it was even ready. But that night, when our hands touched as we both reached for the same knife, I froze. My skin burned where it brushed against his, and I looked up, meeting his eyes. For a moment, everything else disappeared, the sizzling of the pan, the faint music playing in the background, even the thoughts racing in my head. His gaze held mine, steady and searching, and in that silence, I felt something shift, something fall into place inside me. I pulled away quickly, fumbling with an excuse about needing water, but the truth was my heart was beating so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Later that night, after dinner, we ended up on the couch again, the TV on but neither of us really watching. I could feel the tension hanging in the room, unspoken but undeniable. I wanted to say something, to confess the storm of feelings building inside me, but fear gripped me. What if I was wrong? What if I had misread everything, and this connection was only in my head? The risk of losing what we had terrified me more than silence. But he broke it first. He turned to me, his expression softer than I had ever seen, and asked quietly, "What's going on in your head right now?" His words caught me off guard, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. My throat tightened as I tried to form an answer, and before I could stop myself, the truth slipped out. "I think I'm falling for you," I whispered, my voice shaky, almost breaking. The air between us stilled, like the world itself had paused to listen. I couldn't look at him, afraid of what I might see in his face, afraid of rejection, of ruining the one thing that had kept me steady these past weeks. But then I felt his hand on mine, firm and warm, grounding me in a way that made my chest ache with relief. "I've been waiting for you to say that," he admitted, his voice low but filled with certainty. My eyes shot up to meet his, and what I saw there made my heart stop. There was no judgment, no hesitation, only patience, affection, and something deeper, something that mirrored what I had been afraid to name. The walls I had built around myself crumbled in that moment, and all the fear I had carried for weeks dissolved under the weight of his gaze. We didn't rush into anything. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden leap into something physical. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance, a mutual understanding that what we felt was real, that it had been growing between us long before we had the courage to admit it. We sat there, our hands intertwined, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. The world outside didn't matter. The expectations, the doubts, the confusion, all of it faded into the background. What mattered was the warmth of his hand in mine, the softness of his voice when he told me I didn't need to be afraid anymore, and the way my heart finally felt like it was exactly where it belonged. That night, when we finally said goodnight, I lay in bed replaying every second of our conversation. My chest felt lighter than it had in weeks, and though the future was still uncertain, I knew one thing with absolute clarity: I had found something real, something worth holding on to, in the person I had once thought was just my roommate. Life felt different after that night, not because everything suddenly became perfect, but because the weight I had been carrying for so long finally felt lighter. I no longer woke up with the same hollow emptiness that used to greet me every morning after the breakup. Instead, I woke with a quiet warmth, a sense of comfort that came from knowing someone was beside me in this journey, not just as a friend or a roommate, but as something more. The days moved with a gentler rhythm. We still did the same ordinary things, sharing meals, watching shows, talking late into the night, but those moments carried a new depth, a tenderness that made even the simplest routines feel like pieces of something extraordinary. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confessions, it was about the way his hand brushed mine when he passed me a plate, the way his voice softened when he asked how my day was, the way his laughter felt like a promise that I wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in my life, love didn't feel like pressure or expectation. It felt like breathing. It felt like finally being allowed to exist without pretending, without performing, without shrinking into someone else's idea of who I should be. With him, I was simply myself, and that was enough. There were moments when doubt still crept in. I caught myself thinking about the future, about what people might say, about how different this path was from the one I had always imagined. But every time those fears tried to take root, he was there to remind me in quiet ways that love isn't about fitting into boxes, it's about finding someone who makes you feel seen and accepted. He never pushed me, never rushed me, but his steady presence gave me the courage to embrace what my heart already knew. One evening, as we sat together watching the sun set from the balcony, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. I thought about the heartbreak that had shattered me, the nights when loneliness consumed me, the confusion that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about myself. And I thought about him, the way he had been there in the silence, the way his kindness had slowly stitched me back together, the way his honesty had opened a door to a part of myself I didn't even know existed. I realized then that what I once saw as an ending had really been a beginning. Losing my girlfriend had felt like losing my future, but it had actually been the push I needed to step into a world I had been too afraid to explore. He didn't just heal my broken heart, he showed me a new way to love, one built on patience, trust, and authenticity. That night, as the last traces of sunlight faded and the city lights flickered to life, I turned to him and said softly, "Thank you." He looked at me, puzzled, and asked, "For what?" I struggled to put it into words, but I told him thank you for being there when I couldn't stand on my own, thank you for teaching me that love could be safe and real, thank you for showing me that the person I was becoming didn't have to be something to fear. He didn't reply with words. Instead, he reached over, laced his fingers with mine, and gave a small squeeze, as if to say he understood everything I couldn't articulate. In that moment, I knew the truth with a clarity that went deeper than words. I had not just found comfort after heartbreak, I had found home. And home wasn't a place or a plan I once thought I needed. Home was him. Home was us. I learned then that sometimes life has to break you before it can show you where you truly belong. What felt like the worst ending of my life had led me to the most unexpected, beautiful beginning. And though I didn't know what the future held, I knew I no longer had to face it alone. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what was ahead. For the first time, I was ready to live it fully, hand in hand with the person who had opened up a whole new world inside me.